My name is Cassidy Thorne. I am 32 years old. 3 weeks ago, on the sharpest, coldest Tuesday in January, my brother Julian stood on the porch of the only home I've ever known and watched as my suitcase hit the frozen driveway. He didn't drop it. He threw it. It skidded across the ice with a hollow, plastic sound that echoed against the foundation of our family estate. "You have 1 hour to disappear, Cassidy," he said. His breath bloomed in the freezing air like white smoke, but his eyes were as dry as sun-bleached bone. "Dad is gone, the house is mine, and frankly, you've been an uninvited guest in this family for 32 years. It's time the locks caught up to reality." I stood there in the slush, the wind off the Oakhaven coast cutting through my wool coat like a serrated blade. I didn't cry. You don't cry when you've spent 3 decades being treated like a ghost. You just wait for the haunting to end. My father, Silas Thorne, had been lowered into the iron-gray soil of Maine only 3 hours prior. The dirt was still fresh on the shovels when Julian decided to bury me, too. I reached into my collar, my fingers finding the only thing I had left, a thin silver chain with an oval pendant. The date, May 22nd, was engraved on the back in a delicate, slanted hand. It was my mother's. Silas once told me that if she hadn't had me, she'd still be here. He said it when I was 9, and I'd carried that stone in my chest every day since. Before I tell you what was hidden inside this necklace, a secret Julian would eventually try to kill for, I want you to take a second to like and subscribe. But only if you've ever been the person made to feel like a burden in your own home. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you're listening from as the truth finally comes out. Let me take you back to that cemetery on the hill. The wind was howling off the Atlantic, stripping the warmth from the mourners. My brother was up front, draped in a bespoke black overcoat, playing the part of the grieving son with the precision of a stage actor. He shook hands, accepted hushed condolences, and nodded with just the right amount of stoic pain. I stood in the back row, at the very edge of the grass where the mud starts. That's where Silas always put me. At the edges. At the periphery of the frame. When the service ended, I stepped forward to place a handful of white daisies on the casket. I'd heard once they were my mother's favorite. Julian didn't even let the flowers touch the wood. He shifted his weight, a subtle, predatory movement, blocking my path. "He wouldn't want those from you," Julian whispered, his voice a low hiss beneath the wind. "Stand back, Cassidy. That's your place. It always was." I looked at the daisies in my hand, then at the dark mahogany of the casket. My father was gone, and the only person left to hold the leash was my brother. I didn't realize then that Julian wasn't just grieving a father, he was celebrating a promotion. He wasn't just burying a man, he was entombing a legacy he had spent the last year meticulously rewriting. The air inside the Thorne estate felt different that evening. The heat was on, but the house was freezing. The relatives had all filtered out, leaving behind half-empty coffee cups and the lingering scent of damp wool. Julian sat me down at the heavy oak kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat quietly for 1,000 dinners, trying to be invisible so Silas wouldn't remember why he was angry. Julian didn't offer me a seat. He slid a single, stapled document across the polished wood. "Dad's will," he said. His voice was clinical, stripped of the performative grief he'd shown at the graveside. "Updated last year. It's all very clear, Cassidy. The house, the coastal holdings, the bank accounts, every cent goes to me. You aren't mentioned. Not even as an afterthought." I felt the blood drain from my face. A coldness far worse than the Maine winter settled into my marrow. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Mr. Vance has been Dad's attorney for 20 years. He told me years ago that Dad wanted the house split." Julian leaned back, a small, jagged smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Vance retired, Cassidy. Dad went to a new notary. He said he wanted the legacy in strong hands." His words, not mine. I picked up the paper. The signature at the bottom said Silas Thorne. The letters were sharp and confident, but as I traced the loops of the S, something felt off. The slant was too perfect. It looked like my father's hand, but it didn't feel like his soul. It was a replica. A high-fidelity imitation of a man who was too sick to hold a pen in his final months. I grew up in these halls, Julian, I said, my voice cracking. I took care of him for 3 years while you were networking in Portland. I changed his bandages. I sat with him through the night when he called out for Mom. You think he just erased me? Julian stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He walked to the front door and threw it open. The sleet was falling sideways now. White streaks of ice against the black night. I don't think he erased you, Cassidy. I think he finally realized you were never really here to begin with. You have 1 hour. Pack light. The car stays. The keys stay. Everything stays. I packed in the dark. My childhood bedroom felt like a stranger's house. I folded my sweaters, my laptop, and the one framed photo I had of a woman I'd never met, Clara Thorne, holding a newborn me with eyes that looked like they were seeing the future. My hands weren't shaking because I was scared, they were shaking because I was realizing the depth of the trap. I walked out into the sleet with a single suitcase. Julian was standing by his black Audi, checking his watch. I got into my 12-year-old Honda, the engine groaning as it turned over. I drove 3 miles down the coast to the Oakhaven Inn, the neon sign flickering vacancy in a sickly green. I handed the woman at the desk my debit card. Declined, she said, not even looking up from her magazine. I tried my second card. Declined. I sat in the parking lot, the heater in my car rattling as it struggled against the frost, and opened my banking app. The joint account, the one where my savings and my father's monthly stipend lived, was gone. Status: account closed by primary cosigner. Julian hadn't just taken the house, he had cut the oxygen. He had waited until the body was cold to pull the trigger on a plan he'd been building for months. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I had $17 in my purse and a suitcase full of memories that didn't belong to me anymore. I gripped the silver necklace, the pendant biting into my palm. May 22nd. My birthday. The day she died. The day I became the reason Silas Thorne stopped smiling. I closed my eyes and let the cold take me. I thought I was at the end of my story. I thought I was just another girl lost to the Maine winter. I didn't know that 3 blocks away, in a small white house on Elder Street, a woman named Alara was sitting by a greenhouse, waiting for a girl with a silver necklace to walk through her door. The morning broke in shades of bruised purple and gray. I'd spent the night in the car, my breath frosting the windows into frozen webs. My neck felt like rusted wire. I drove into Oakhaven's small town square, desperate for a plan, or at least a cup of coffee I could afford. That's when I saw it, a handwritten card pinned to the corkboard outside the community grocer. Asterisk room for rent. $400 a month. Elder Street. Quiet. Call Alara asterisk. The address took me to the edge of town, where the salt spray from the cliffs reaches the windows. The house was a modest, 2-story colonial with white paint peeling in elegant strips, but the greenhouse attached to the side was glowing with life. Even in the dead of January, I could see vibrant green ferns and the shock of red hibiscus behind the glass. A woman opened the door. She was tall, her silver hair pulled back into a loose knot, with eyes that seemed to look right through my winter coat. She didn't look like a landlord, she looked like a sentinel. I'm here about the room, I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle. Alara didn't look at my suitcase. Her gaze dropped instantly to my throat, to the silver oval pendant resting against my collarbone. She didn't just look at it, she stared. I saw her hand move, a sudden clench of her fingers against the doorframe. Her breath hitched. Come in, she whispered. Her voice was thick with emotion. You're Cassidy, aren't you? My heart stopped. I hadn't told her my name. I hadn't even called the number on the card yet. How do you know who I am? I asked, stepping into the warmth of a hallway that smelled of lavender and damp earth. Alara closed the door and turned to face me. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the silver necklace. Because I was the one who helped Clara engrave that date, she said. And because I've spent 32 years waiting for you to find your way back to the woman who loved you before you ever drew a breath. I stood there, the suitcase falling from my hand, as the first crack appeared in the 32-year lie Silas Thorne had built around me. Alara looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt seen. But as she moved to take my coat, she leaned in and whispered something that made the hair on my arms stand up. You need to be careful, Cassidy. Julian was here yesterday. He wasn't looking for a room. He was looking for a shoebox. And he's willing to burn this town down to make sure you never open it. The warmth of Alara's hallway was a physical weight, thick with the scent of damp earth and rosemary, a stark contrast to the sterile air of the Thorne estate. I stood there, my boots leaking gray slush onto her polished floor, while her words hung in the air like heavy fog. She knew my name. She knew my mother. And she knew that Julian had been here only 24 hours ago, hunting for a ghost. Julian was here? I whispered, my voice finally cracking. Alara didn't answer immediately. She took my suitcase, the one that held my entire life, and set it by the stairs with a steady hand. He was looking for a shoebox, Cassidy. He called it family property. But he doesn't realize that Clara didn't leave her legacy in a box. She left it with people who knew how to keep a secret. She led me into the kitchen, where a small greenhouse was visible through a glass door. Green things thrived there, defiant against the Maine frost. I sat at her wooden table, my fingers trembling as I reached for the silver necklace. He wants this, doesn't he? I asked. Alara sat across from me, her silver hair catching the morning light. He wants what it represents, Cassidy. For 32 years, your father and brother have told you that you were the reason Clara Thorne died. They used your guilt to keep you small. To keep you serving a man who didn't deserve your shadow. She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto mine. But Julian knows the truth is starting to leak. Silas is gone, and the dam is breaking. You aren't a tenant here, Cassidy. You're the reason I kept this house. The next 3 days were a blur of adrenaline and paranoia. I moved through Oakhaven like a stranger in my own skin. I called the accounting firm where I'd worked for 6 years, hoping for a return to the mundane. Linda, the receptionist, picked up on the first ring, but her voice was hollow. Cassidy, she stammered. Your brother was here yesterday. He spent 2 hours in Mr. Greer's office. My stomach dropped. What did he say, Linda? There was a long pause. He told them you were having a mental break. He said the grief had pushed you over the edge. He brought paperwork, Cassidy. He suggested the firm give you a permanent leave of absence for your own safety. I hung up before she could finish. Julian wasn't just taking the house, he was erasing my existence. He was painting me as unstable, making sure that if I ever spoke up about the will, no one would believe a word I said. I opened my email and saw a forwarded thread from my cousin, Grace. It was a message Julian had sent to our entire family circle. The subject line read, "Update on Cassidy's well-being." I read the words, and they felt like physical blows. Cassidy has made the difficult decision to leave Oakhaven to seek treatment. She was not herself at the funeral. We ask for your prayers and your distance. He had turned my exile into a narrative of brotherly concern. He was the hero, the protector of a fragile sister. I checked my phone, 12 missed calls from relatives. Not one asked how I was. Every single one asked why I was being so difficult for Julian during his time of loss. By Friday, the walls felt like they were closing in. I was sitting in the greenhouse with Alara when my phone buzzed with a text from Julian. I'm looking at Mom's jewelry box, Cassidy. It's sitting on Dad's desk, right where it belongs. I noticed the silver pendant is missing. I'll make you a deal. Give me the necklace, and I'll pay your rent for a year. I'll even tell Greer you're recovered so you can have your little job back. It's just a piece of scrap metal to you. To me, it's the final piece of the estate. Asterisk. I stared at the screen, my fist clenching around the silver oval until the edges bit into my palm. He was bartering for my mother's memory like a line item on a ledger. He wants to trade, I told Alara, sliding the phone across the potting bench. She read the message, her face hardening into a mask of disdain. He's desperate, she said. He doesn't want the silver, Cassidy. He wants the serial number. He knows that Clara didn't trust Silas, and he knows that whatever she left behind is locked behind a code that only that pendant carries. She looked at me, her gaze steady. He thinks you're a victim. He thinks if he squeezes hard enough, you'll break like you always have. I looked at the ferns thriving in the middle of winter and felt a new heat rising in my chest. He's wrong, I said. I'm not breaking. I'm just starting to read the fine print. I called Sarah, a friend from law school who had stayed in the shadows while I dealt with my father's illness. I told her everything. Sarah's voice was sharp, the sound of a blade being sharpened. Cassidy, if the longtime attorney didn't certify that will, then who did? I'm going to the county registrar. But you need to stay put. If Julian is this focused on that necklace, he isn't just greedy. He's hiding a debt the Thorne estate is supposed to pay for. I hung up and looked at Alara. She was standing by the door of the greenhouse, holding an old, battered shoebox. It's time, Cassidy, she said. Julian came looking for this, but he forgot one thing. Secrets aren't kept in boxes. They're kept in stories. And it's time you heard the one Silas tried to kill. The salt-heavy wind rattled the glass of the greenhouse, a constant reminder that Oakhaven was built on shifting tides and hidden depths. I watched a single bead of condensation roll down a fern leaf, my mind spinning with the name Sarah had dropped over the phone, Frank Marshall. He wasn't just a notary, he was Julian's shadow. They had run a failed real estate project into the ground together 2 years ago, leaving a debt Julian had been scrambling to bury ever since. He didn't just forge a will, Alara, I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. He's using Dad's estate as a personal bank to pay back Marshall for a mess they made together. Alara didn't look up from the potting soil. She just nodded. Desperate men don't build legacies, Cassidy. They build cages. And Julian has been building yours since the day Clara died. She set her trowel down and looked at me. But a cage only works if the bird believes the bars are real. Sarah's finding the cracks. You just need to be ready to fly through them. I felt a sudden vibration in my pocket, a text from an unknown number. Asterisk Patterson's office is closed for a reason, Cassidy. Stop digging or you'll find exactly what happened to the last person who asked about the 1996 draft. Asterisk I stared at the screen, the threat sitting there like a cold weight. Julian wasn't just bartering anymore. He was warning me. The truth didn't come with a scream, it came with a shoebox. Alara led me to the small attic space above the greenhouse, a room that smelled of dried lavender and ancient paper. She pulled a battered cardboard box from beneath a loose floorboard and set it on a small cedar desk. For 32 years, Silas told you that you were the reason your mother died, Alara said, her voice thick with grief. He made you carry the weight of her absence as if it were a crime you committed just by breathing. She opened the lid, revealing a stack of faded Polaroids and a bundle of letters tied with a blue silk ribbon. I picked up the first photo. It was Clara, her dark hair windblown, laughing on the cliffs. She was visibly, beautifully pregnant. She knew, Cassidy, Alara whispered. The doctors told her that her heart wouldn't survive the delivery. Silas begged her to terminate. He didn't want a child, he wanted his wife. But Clara, she chose you. I traced the curve of my mother's smile in the photograph, my chest tightening. She didn't die because of me, I whispered. She died for me. Alara handed me a final snapshot. It was Clara in a hospital bed, pale and translucent, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a white blanket. Around her neck was the silver necklace. She held you for 6 hours, Cassidy. She spent every one of those minutes telling you how much she loved you. How she had planned for you, and how you were her greatest victory. I felt the stone in my chest finally shatter, replaced by searing clarity. I wasn't a murderer. I was a legacy. And Silas had spent my entire life lying to me because he couldn't stand to look at the living proof of the choice he had lost. The secret was hidden in plain sight, etched into the very silver I had clutched for comfort during every lonely night of my childhood. Alara reached across the desk and took the necklace from my hand. Look at the engraving, Cassidy. Not just the date. She handed me a jeweler's loupe. I held it to the back of the pendant, magnifying the delicate script of May 22nd. Deep within the housing of the clasp, nearly invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny serial number. It's not just a date, Alara said. It's a key. Clara came from old Connecticut money, wealth Silas never had access to. She set up an independent trust, an irrevocable one, that Silas tried to break for decades. He couldn't. The only way to activate it was for you to turn 30 and present the physical key to the trust officer. I stared at the numbers. The logic of Julian's desperation finally clicked. He didn't want the silver for its sentimental value. He needed that serial number to intercept the trust before I ever found out it existed. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and he was sitting on a forged will, waiting for the one piece of evidence that could save or sink him. I looked at Alara. My reflection in her eyes no longer looked like a ghost, but like a woman about to reclaim everything Silas Thorne had tried to bury. We're going to the trust office, I said, my voice steady for the first time in my life. And then, I'm going to Julian's dinner party. Alara smiled, a slow, grim expression of triumph. I'll drive, she said. But Cassidy, the trust isn't just money. There's a letter in that vault. One Silas spent 32 years trying to burn. Make sure you read every word before you look your brother in the eye. The drive to Allentown was 3 hours of jagged coastline transitioning into the industrial brick and iron of Pennsylvania. I held the silver necklace in my fist, the serial number etched into my palm like a brand. Beside me, Alara drove with focused intensity. She wasn't just a landlady, she was the guardian of a bridge I was finally crossing. We pulled up to First Heritage Trust, a granite monolith that looked as immovable as the secrets it held. Inside, the air was filtered and hushed. We sat in a windowless conference room across from a trust officer named Sandra Chin. She didn't look at my tired eyes or my salt-stained coat. She looked at the identification Sarah had helped me prep, and then she looked at the necklace. I unclasped it and handed it over. Sandra placed it under a magnifying lens, her eyes scanning the hidden housing of the clasp. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she typed a code into her terminal. Match confirmed, she said, her voice a clinical chime in the quiet room. The serial corresponds to the trust identification code filed in 1993. Your mother didn't just leave you a date, Cassidy. She left you a key. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. I read the number at the bottom 3 times. $1,183,412. It wasn't just money, it was 32 years of compound interest on a life Silas Thorne told me was a mistake. Then, Sandra reached into a fireproof safe and pulled out a yellowed, wax-sealed envelope. This was included at the time of establishment, she said. For Cassidy, when she's ready. I didn't open the letter in the office. I waited until we were back in the car, the heater rattling against the Pennsylvania chill. My mother's handwriting was a beautiful, slanted script that mirrored my own. You're kicking right now, it began. She wrote about the fear Silas carried. How he loved her like a possession he was terrified to lose, and how he already resented the space I took up in her body. He loves the mirror, but he hates the glass, she wrote. Asterisk, I am afraid that when I'm gone, he'll try to erase you because you look too much like the version of me he couldn't control. Asterisk, it wasn't just proof of money, it was proof of intent. My mother hadn't just died, she had outsmarted a tyrant from beyond the grave. She had built a wall of protection around a daughter she'd never see grow up. She knew, Alara, I whispered, the paper trembling in my hand. She knew he'd try to make me invisible. Alara looked at the road, her jaw set. And now, she said, you're going to make sure he, and Julian, never look away again. The evidence was waiting for us when we crossed back into Oakhaven. We met in a dark corner of a local diner, the smell of grease and rain hanging in the air. Sarah laid out the document examiner's findings like a deck of cards. The signature on the 2024 amendment? It's a total forgery, Cassidy. The pen pressure is wrong, and the ink saturation is inconsistent with your father's natural hand. But the real blow was the audit of Julian's finances. Julian is drowning, Sarah whispered, leaning in. He and Frank Marshall didn't just fail a project. They leveraged the Thorne estate for a $600,000 construction loan while Silas was bedridden. If you inherit your 50%, the bank discovers the unauthorized mortgage immediately. Julian isn't just greedy, he's a felon waiting for a sentencing date. I looked at the forged will, then at my mother's letter. Julian wasn't just taking my house, he was using my mother's legacy to pay for his own incompetence. He had mortgaged the roof over my head to cover his debts with the man who helped him steal it. The plan was no longer about survival. It was about a very public demolition. He's hosting a celebration of Silas dinner tonight, I said, checking my watch. A room full of the very people he told I was unstable. I stood up, the silver necklace catching the diner's neon light. He wanted an audience. I'm going to give him a show. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't need one. I had the truth, and for the first time in 32 years, the truth had a bank account. I walked out of the diner and toward the house on the hill, the wind off the Atlantic finally feeling like it was at my back. Julian Thorne thought he was burying his sister. He didn't realize he had just handed me the shovel. The iron gates of the Thorne estate were open, swallowed by a thick coastal fog that turned the driveway into a blurred, gray tunnel. I didn't stop to check my reflection. I didn't need to. I could feel the silver necklace resting against my collarbone, no longer a weight, but a compass. As I stepped onto the porch, the muffled sound of laughter and the clinking of silverware drifted through the heavy oak doors. It was the sound of a victory lap I hadn't been invited to run. I pushed the doors open. The foyer was filled with the scent of expensive cedar and rosemary, the very same herbs Alara grew in her greenhouse, but here, they smelled like a cover-up. I walked toward the dining room, my heels striking the hardwood with deliberate, rhythmic precision. Julian was at the head of the table, my father's gold watch gleaming on his wrist as he gestured toward the local magistrate. He was mid-sentence, his voice smooth and rehearsed. And as Dad always said, the strength of the family is in its. He stopped. The room went silent. I wasn't the fragile sister seeking treatment, I was the ghost who had finally found the keys to the house. I didn't come for the roast, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a northern gale. I came because you forgot to mention one thing in your celebration of Silas. You forgot to mention that the man who notarized your new will is the same man who helped you mortgage this house into a $600,000 grave. I walked to the table and laid the forensic report and the trust documents directly onto the white linen cloth, right next to his wine glass. The reveal wasn't just my wealth. It was the fact that I had used my mother's trust to buy Julian's defaulted business debt that morning. I wasn't just his sister anymore. I was his largest creditor. I looked at the relatives who had shunned me and then back at my brother, whose face had drained to a sickly gray. I am not the burden in this room, Julian. I am the owner. And you have exactly 1 hour to pack your bags. The confrontation didn't end with a scream. It ended in the quiet, shadowed corridor outside my father's study an hour later. The guests had fled, the celebration ending in a frantic scramble of coats and hushed excuses. Julian was leaning against the wall, his shoulders slumped, the bravado stripped away to reveal the hollow man Silas had shaped. He held his phone in his hand, a final call from Frank Marshall informing him the game was up. He broke me, too, Cassidy, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. Every time he looked at me, he saw a soldier he had to train. Every time he looked at you, he saw the casualty of the war he lost. I forged that signature because I was drowning in the expectations of a dead man. I stood 3 feet away, the space between us filled with 32 years of resentment. I understood him then, The way Silas had used us both as weapons against the memory of a woman he couldn't control. But understanding wasn't an excuse. I looked at the man who had thrown my suitcase into the ice and realized Silas hadn't just erased me, he had hollowed out Julian until there was nothing left but greed and fear. "I know, Julian," I said softly. "But you chose the shove." "I'm choosing the door." I didn't hug him. I just watched him walk toward the stairs, a man finally realizing the crown he stole was made of lead. My story began again 6 months later, under a June sun that turned the Oakhaven cliffs into gold. The Thorne estate didn't belong to a ghost anymore. I had sold the Maine house, the silence was too thick there, and moved permanently into a renovated wing of Alara's Colonial. The sign on the small brick office in the town square didn't say Silas Thorne and Son. It read Thorne and Daughters, Forensic Accounting and Estate Management. I spent my days helping women like the ones Alara described, women whose legacies had been hidden behind formalities and family secrets. I wasn't just managing money, I was restoring voices. Every Wednesday, Alara and I sat on the new white porch I'd built, watching the ferns thrive in the salt air. I still wear the silver necklace. It's a reminder that the people who decide your worth are rarely the ones who actually know it. I looked out at the Atlantic, the waves crashing against the rocks with a power that didn't need anyone's permission. My name is Cassidy Thorne. I am 32 years old. And I finally learned that you are allowed to change the locks, even on the house they told you you'd never own. I am no longer an uninvited guest. I am the one who keeps the books. And the books, for the first time in 32 years, finally balance. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you've ever felt invisible, remember, the light always finds a way through the glass. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. What's the one boundary you're finally ready to set? I read every single one. Until next time, stay strong. Your story is just beginning.